The snow fell steadily outside the Georgian colonial house in Westchester County, New York, each flake catching the warm yellow light spilling from the windows. Inside, the Morrison family's annual Christmas Eve dinner was in full swing.
The
Mahogany dining table groaned under the weight of prime rib, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole. While the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, David Morrison, 34, sat at the far end of the table, his chair positioned slightly away from the others. His navy blazer hung loose on his thin frame, and his dark hair, peppered with premature gray, needed a trim. He watched his family laugh and share stories, feeling like he was observing them through glass. And then Jake scored the winning touchdown in the final seconds. Uncle Robert boomed, slapping his son's shoulder. The 22-year-old beamed, his college letterman jacket stretched across broad shoulders. "That's my boy," Aunt Margaret chimed in, her wedding ring catching the chandelier light as she reached for her wine glass. David's mother, Patricia, a woman whose silver hair was always perfectly coiffed, smiled warmly. "We're so proud of you, Jake. A full scholarship to State University. What an achievement." The conversation flowed like a river around David, but he remained an island. His younger sister Emma, 28, and radiant in her red dress, was regaling everyone with tales of her promotion to marketing director at a prestigious firm in Manhattan. "The client loved our campaign so much, they're expanding our contract," Emma said, her engagement ring sparkling as she gestured. "Mark and I are thinking of buying a house in Scarsdale next year. More congratulations." More toasts. More celebration of everyone else's successes. David's father, William, a distinguished man with silver temples and kind eyes, stood up slowly. At 71, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades building a successful accounting practice. "I think it's time for our traditional Christmas toasts," he announced, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. The room fell into an expectant hush. This was the Morrison family tradition, a tradition which person would be honored with a toast. Their achievements of the past year celebrated, and their future blessed. William raised his glass of burgundy wine. To Jake, for his incredible athletic achievements and academic excellence. "May your future be as bright as your past year has been," to Jake. The table chorused, glasses clinking together like church bells. Jake stood, his face flushed with pride and wine. "Thanks, everyone. This family means everything to me," William continued, turning to Emma. "To my beautiful daughter Emma, whose career success and engagement to Mark show us all what determination and grace can achieve." To Emma, another round of clinking glasses. Emma dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. "I love you all so much. This family has always been my foundation." Toasts continued around the table. Cousin Sarah, the pediatric nurse who'd won an award for her work with terminally ill children. Uncle Robert, who'd just opened his third hardware store. Aunt Margaret, who'd completed her master's degree at 50-5. David watched it all, his own wine glass sitting untouched on the white tablecloth. His palms were sweating despite the December chill creeping through the windows. He knew what was coming, or rather what wasn't coming. The moments stretched like taffy as William made his way around the table. Each toast a small celebration, each person standing to accept their family's love and recognition. David's chest tightened with each passing minute. Finally, William sat down. The room buzzed with warm conversation as people began to dig into dessert, his mother's famous apple pie with vanilla ice cream. David stared at his untouched plate, the silence around him deafening despite the chatter. No toast, no recognition, no acknowledgement that he even existed. "David, you're not eating," his mother said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "Are you feeling all right?" All eyes turned to him. He felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm fine, Mom, just taking it all in." But he wasn't fine. He was a 34-year-old man who'd been working as a substitute teacher for 3 years, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a rattling exhaust pipe. He had no wife, no children, no impressive career accomplishments to share. He was invisible. After dinner, the family migrated to the living room where a massive Christmas tree dominated the corner, its lights twinkling like stars. The fireplace crackled with fresh logs, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with family photos, none of which featured David prominently. David found himself standing alone by the window, watching the snow accumulate on the brick walkway. His reflection stared back at him, a ghost superimposed over the winter landscape. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, son." David turned to find his grandfather, Frank Morrison, approaching with 2 glasses of bourbon. At 8, Frank was a man whose presence still commanded attention. His steel-gray hair was combed back, and his blue eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the loss of his beloved wife 3 years ago. "Here," Frank said, offering David a glass. "Jameson, your grandmother's favorite. She always said it could cure anything except stupidity." David accepted the drink gratefully. "Thanks, Grandpa." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. Frank had always been different from the rest of the family, quieter, more observant, less concerned with appearances and achievements. "You notice it too, don't you?" Frank said finally, his voice low enough that only David could hear. "Notice what?" "The way they treat you, like you're not quite part of the family." David's throat tightened. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "I don't know what you mean." Frank turned to face him, those penetrating blue eyes studying David's face. "Son, I've been watching this family for nearly 9 decades. I've seen how they celebrate success and how they handle ... disappointment." "I'm not disappointed," David said quickly. "I'm just figuring things out." At 34, the question hung in the air like smoke. David took a sip of bourbon, feeling it burn down his throat. "Some people are late bloomers." Frank nodded. Slowly. "Your father was 28 when he started his accounting practice. Your mother was 32 when she had Emma. Success isn't a race, David. It's a journey." From across the room, Emma's laughter rang out like silver bells. She was showing off her engagement ring to the cousins, the diamond catching the firelight. Mark, her fiancé, stood beside her with his arm around her waist, looking like he'd stepped out of a catalog. "But it doesn't feel like a journey," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like I'm standing still while everyone else is moving forward." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would echo in David's mind for years to come. "You know, David, not everyone's worth celebrating. Some people peak early, shine bright for a moment, then fade. Others take longer to find their light. But when do they illuminate everything around them?" "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your father and the rest of this family, they see achievement as a series of checkboxes. College degree, check. Good job, check. Marriage, check. House, check. They think that's what makes a person valuable." Frank took a sip of his bourbon, his weathered hand steady. "But I've lived long enough to know that the people who matter most aren't always the ones getting toasts at Christmas dinner. Sometimes they're the ones sitting quietly in the corner, watching, learning, growing." David felt something shift inside him, not quite hope, but a crack in the wall of despair he'd built around himself. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see something in you that they don't. You care about people, David. You chose to be a teacher not because it pays well, but because you believe in making a difference. That's worth more than all the trophies and promotions in the world." Before David could respond, his father's voice cut through the room. "Dad, come join us. We're about to exchange gifts." Frank squeezed David's shoulder. "Remember what I said, son? Your time will come. And when it does, you'll understand why you had to wait." The day after Christmas, David stood in front of his 6th grade classroom at public school, 204 in Queens. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn linoleum floor. Most teachers had the week off, but David had volunteered to run a winter activities program for kids whose parents couldn't afford childcare. 12 students sat before him, a mix of cultures and backgrounds that represented the beautiful diversity of New York City. Maria Gonzalez, whose parents worked double shifts at a laundromat. Kevin Chen, whose mother cleaned offices at night. Jamal Washington, who lived with his grandmother in a housing project. These weren't the privileged kids from Westchester County. These were children who understood struggle, who knew that success wasn't guaranteed, who had to fight for every opportunity. "Okay, everyone," David said, his voice warm despite the cold radiating from the old windows. Today we're going to talk about goals. Not just any goals, but the kind of goals that matter. A hand shot up. Mr. Morrison, my mom says goals are for rich people. David paused, considering his words carefully. What's your name again? Destiny Johnson. Well, Destiny, your mom has been working really hard to take care of you, hasn't she? That's a goal. Every day, she sets a goal to make sure you have food, shelter, and love. Goals aren't about being rich. They're about deciding what's important and working toward it. He pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with lesson plans and student observations. I want each of you to write down one thing you want to accomplish this year. Not something your parents want, not something you think you should want, but something that matters to you. The students bent over their papers, pencils scratching against the silence. David walked between the desks, offering encouragement and guidance. This was where he felt most alive, not at family dinners with their performative toasts, but here with kids who needed someone to believe in them. Mr. Morrison, Kevin said, looking up from his paper. I want to be a doctor, but my dad says we can't afford medical school. Your dad's worried about money because he loves you, David replied. But you know what? Some of the best doctors I know came from families just like yours. They worked hard, got scholarships, and never gave up on their dreams. He knelt beside Kevin's desk. You want to know a secret? I didn't always want to be a teacher. I wanted to be a lot of things: a lawyer, a businessman, a writer. But life has a way of showing you where you belong. Do you like being a teacher? Jamal asked. David considered the question. Did he like it? He made $38,000 a year, lived in a cramped apartment, and drove a car that might not start on cold mornings. His family saw him as a failure, a man who'd never quite figured out his life. But when he looked at these kids, when he saw the spark of understanding in their eyes, when former students sent him graduation photos or thank you notes, liked it. More than that, he loved it. I love being a teacher, he said simply, because I get to work with people like you people who are going to change the world. Destiny raised her hand again. Mr. Morrison, do you have kids? No, I don't. Then, we're your kids, right? The question hit him like a physical blow. These children, with their secondhand clothes and worn backpacks, with their dreams that seemed impossible and their determination that was unbreakable, they were his kids. More than the biological children he'd never had, more than the family, who barely acknowledged his existence. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are. As the day continued, David found himself thinking about his grandfather's words. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe worth wasn't measured in salary figures or dinner table toasts. Maybe it was measured in the lives you touched, the hope you planted, the futures you helped shape. When the final bell rang and the students filed out, chattering about their plans for the rest of winter break, David sat alone in his classroom. The setting sun painted the walls orange and gold. And for the first time in months, he didn't feel invisible. He felt necessary. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made Manhattan streets glisten like ice rinks. David walked home from the subway, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. His apartment building, a pre-war structure with radiators that clanged through the night, looked particularly uninviting in the harsh streetlight. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Nye, party at the Ritz. Wish you were here? Attached was a photo of her and Mark surrounded by friends in evening wear, champagne glasses raised in celebration. David stared at the image for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Inside his apartment, he heated up leftover Chinese takeout and sat at his small kitchen table, grading papers by lamplight. The radiator knocked rhythmically like a metronome counting out the seconds of his solitary evening. A knock at his door startled him. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting at this hour? He opened the door to find Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, standing in the hallway wearing a thick robe and slippers. Mr. Morrison, she said in her accented English, I'm sorry to bother you so late. Kevin is very upset. He's been crying for hours. David's heart immediately went to his student. What's wrong? His father. He lost his job today at the restaurant where he worked for 15 years. They closed. Kevin heard his parents arguing about money, about maybe having to move back to his uncle's place in Chinatown. Without hesitation, David grabbed his jacket. "Take me to him." The Chen apartment was identical to David's in layout, but felt completely different. The walls were covered with Kevin's artwork and school certificates. The smell of jasmine tea lingered in the air. Kevin sat on the couch, his face red from crying, clutching a math workbook. "Kevin," David said gently, sitting beside him. "Your grandmother told me what happened. I'm so sorry." "We're going to have to move," Kevin said, his voice breaking. "I won't be able to go to your school anymore. And my dad, he's so sad. He keeps saying he failed us." David felt a familiar ache in his chest, the pain of watching someone you care about suffer. "Kevin, look at me. Your father didn't fail anyone. Sometimes things happen that are beyond our control. That doesn't make us failures. But what if? I can't become a doctor now? What if we don't have money for college?" David was quiet for a moment, remembering his grandfather's words about people who illuminate everything around them. "You know what, Kevin? I'm going to tell you something that someone very wise told me recently. Success isn't about having everything handed to you. It's about what you do when things get difficult." He pulled out his phone and showed Kevin a picture from his wallet, a photo of his grandfather in his Navy uniform from World War II. "This is my grandfather. He grew up during the Great Depression when lots of families lost everything. But he didn't let that stop him from building a good life." Kevin studied the photo. What did he do? He worked 3 jobs to put himself through college. He served his country in the war. He started a business with nothing but determination and hope. And you know what the most important thing he taught me was? That the people who matter most aren't always the ones who have it easy. They're the ones who keep going when things get hard. They're the ones who help others even when they're struggling themselves. Mrs. Chen appeared with a tray of tea and cookies. "Kevin," she said in Mandarin, then switched to English. "Mr. Morrison is right. Our family came here with nothing but hope. Your grandfather worked in a laundry for 30 years, so your father could go to school. Now your father will find new work, and you will study hard, and you will become a doctor." David accepted the tea gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "Kevin, I want you to know something. No matter what happens, no matter where you live or what school you attend, you can always call me. I believe in you, and I'm going to help you reach your goals." Really? "And I'll tell you what else. I'm going to start a tutoring program for students who need extra help, free of charge. Because that's what teachers do. We don't just teach in classrooms. We teach wherever we're needed." As midnight approached, David found himself still sitting with the Chen family, helping Kevin with his math homework and listening to stories about their journey from China to America. When the clock struck 12 and fireworks exploded over the city, David wasn't thinking about the party he wasn't attending or the family who'd forgotten to toast him. He was thinking about purpose, about the way Kevin's face lit up when he solved a difficult problem, about Mrs. Chen's grateful smile, about the dozen other students who needed someone to believe in them. For the first time in years, David felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Spring arrived in Queens with the kind of tentative warmth that made people believe in second chances. David's tutoring program had grown from Kevin Chen to 15 students, meeting twice a week in the school library. Word had spread through the community like wildfire. Here was a teacher who cared enough to give up his evenings to help kids who couldn't afford expensive tutoring services. The program wasn't just about academics. David had started incorporating life skills, goal setting, and character building into their sessions. He brought in guest speakers, a nurse from the local hospital who'd grown up in the projects, small business owner who'd immigrated from El Salvador, college professor who'd been the first in his family to graduate high school, Mr. Morrison. Maria Gonzalez said one evening as they worked on algebra problems, "My mom wants to know if you can come to dinner on Sunday. She wants to thank you for helping me with my grades." David looked up from the whiteboard where he'd been explaining quadratic equations. "That's very kind of her, Maria. But I'm just doing my job." "No, you're not," said Jamal Washington, not looking up from his science textbook. Teachers don't usually give up their free time like this. Ms. Rodriguez told me you could be making more money doing private tutoring for rich kids? Ms. Rodriguez talks too much, David said with a smile, but Jamal's words stuck with him. It was true. He'd been approached by parents from Manhattan who were willing to pay $50 an hour for test prep, but he'd turned them down. These kids needed him more. As the weeks passed, David noticed changes in his students that went beyond improved grades. Kevin Chen had started a science club at school. Destiny Johnson was writing for the school newspaper. Jamal had joined the debate team. They were finding their voices, discovering their strengths, building confidence that would serve them long after they left his classroom. But the most profound change was in David himself. He'd started waking up excited about the day ahead. He'd begun writing again, not the novel he'd abandoned in his 20s, but articles about education, about serving underprivileged communities, about finding purpose in unexpected places. One evening in April, as he was packing up after tutoring, his phone rang. It was his grandfather. David, I've been thinking about our conversation at Christmas, Frank said without preamble. I want to know about this tutoring program I've been hearing about. David was surprised. How did you hear about it? I still have friends in the education community. Word gets around when someone's doing something worthwhile. Tell me about it. As David described the program, he could hear the pride in his grandfather's voice. That's exactly what I was talking about, son. You're not just teaching math and science. You're teaching these kids that they matter, that someone believes in them. It's worth more than any corner office or fancy car. It doesn't feel like enough sometimes, David admitted. When I see Emma buying her house, or Jake signing with that law firm, David, let me tell you something. I've watched your sister and your cousin build their careers. They're good people, and they work hard. But what they're doing, thousands of other people could do just as well. What you're doing, that's irreplaceable. Frank paused, and David could hear the weight of decades in his voice. During the war, I served with a man named Joe Martinez. He wasn't the smartest guy in our unit, wasn't the strongest, wasn't the most skilled, but when we were pinned down by enemy fire, when everyone else was thinking about saving themselves, Joe was thinking about how to save everyone else. He never got medals or recognition, but he saved more lives than any hero you've ever heard of. What happened to him? He went home after the war, became a teacher in a small town in Texas, taught for 40 years. At his funeral, there were hundreds of people, former students, their children, their grandchildren. People whose lives he'd touched, whose futures he'd shaped. Tell me, David, what's worth more? The temporary praise of a Christmas toast, or the lasting impact of a life well lived? After the call ended, David sat in his empty classroom, watching the sun set over Queens. He thought about his students, about the spark he saw in their eyes when they mastered a difficult concept, about the letters he'd started receiving from former students who'd gone on to college, 2 careers, 2 lives they'd never imagined possible. He thought about the ripple effect, how one person's belief in another could change the trajectory of a life. That changed life could then change others, creating an endless chain of positive impact that stretched across generations. 4. The first time, David understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him. Success wasn't about being celebrated at family dinners. It was about being the kind of person who made celebration possible for others. The following Christmas Eve found David in a very different place than he'd been a year ago. The snow fell. Just as steadily outside the Morrison family home, but inside everything had changed. David arrived carrying a briefcase full of letters and photos, testimonials from students, parents, and colleagues about his tutoring program, which had grown to serve over 50 students and had attracted attention from the New York City Department of Education. David, his mother exclaimed as he entered, we were just talking about you. Emma showed us the article in the Times about your program. Indeed, the New York Times had run a feature story about David's tutoring initiative, highlighting how one teacher's commitment to his community had created a model for educational support that was being studied by school districts across the country. It's nothing special, David said, but his voice carried a confidence that hadn't been there the year before. It's just trying to help where I can. Nothing special, his father said, approaching with a broad smile. David, you've been invited to speak at the state education conference. The mayor's office wants to expand your program citywide. That's extraordinary. As the family gathered for dinner, David noticed how differently he was being treated. People asked about his work, his students, his future plans. Emma, radiant in her maternity glow, had brought printouts of the online comments from the Times article. Dozens of teachers from around the country asking how they could implement similar programs. "David," said Uncle Robert, "I have to ask, how did you know this was your calling?" David considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. "I don't think I knew exactly. I just knew that I wanted to matter, to make a difference. It took me a while to understand that making a difference doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like." When the time came for toasts, David felt the familiar tightening in his chest. But this time, it wasn't from anxiety, it was from anticipation. His father stood, glass in hand, and looked directly at David. "This year I want to start with someone who has reminded us all what true success looks like. To my son David, who has shown us that the measure of a man isn't in his bank account or his job title, but in the lives he touches and the hope he creates." "To David," the room chorused, and this time David stood to accept their recognition. But as he looked around the table, David realized something profound. The toast felt nice, but it didn't feel necessary. The validation he'd spent years craving no longer seemed important. He'd found something better than his family's approval. He'd found his own sense of worth. "Thank you," he said simply. "But I want to toast someone else tonight, to Grandpa, who taught me that not everyone's worth celebrating at the same time. But everyone's worth celebrating eventually. Some of us just need to find our light first." Frank, now 90, raised his glass with a trembling hand and a proud smile. "To finding your light, David, and to sharing it with others." As the evening progressed, David found himself telling stories. About his students, Kevin, who'd been accepted to a prestigious pre-med program. Maria, who'd received a full scholarship to study journalism. Jamal, who'd been elected student body president. Each story was a small celebration. It's a testament to the power of believing in someone who'd never been believed in before. Later, as the family exchanged gifts, David presented his grandfather with a special package, a leather-bound book containing letters from every student he'd tutored, each one thanking Frank for raising a grandson who'd changed their lives. "You were right, Grandpa," David said, as the old man wiped tears from his eyes. "Some people do take longer to find their light, but when they do, they can illuminate everything around them." Frank looked up at his grandson, his eyes bright with pride and love. "You didn't just find your light, David. You became the light. That's a gift that we'll keep giving long after we're all gone." As the evening wound down and the family prepared to leave, David felt a profound sense of peace. He was still a substitute teacher living in Queens, still single, still driving that old Honda, but he was no longer invisible. He was necessary. He was valued. He was home. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake unique and beautiful in its own way, just like the lives he'd been privileged to touch. And David Morrison, the manhood, once felt forgotten at Christmas dinner, now understood that the greatest celebration wasn't in being toasted by others, but in being the reason others had something to celebrate. In the end, that was worth more than any recognition. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere in the city, 15 young people were sleeping more peacefully because someone had believed in them, had seen their potential, had helped them find their own light. That was the true gift of Christmas, and David Morrison had finally learned how to unwrap it.